For evolution, we're going to talk about evolution, and then it's going to go into speciation towards the end. A couple things that I want to say real quick. So evolution is a concept that we do have to teach. So I don't know what you believe, and I'm not asking you to believe anything specific. Can we please and thank you not have any controversial conversations where you're like fighting with me, because I'm not going to fight with you. If you don't think dinosaurs existed, that's cool. But it's not anything that I think we need to go talk to the dean about. Okay? I'm cool with that. I'm just going to say cool, whatever. I'm not asking you to change your religion or go against what you believe. I'm just telling you what's on the test. Okay? So I just go in there. All right? So evolution, and we're talking about biological evolution. So first of all, when you say biological, what is this dealing with? Life. And the one thing that we know about life is it is constantly changing as a result of random mutations, right? Random mutations. And what is a mutation? A random change in your genetic information. What is your genetic information? Your DNA. Remember, DNA, genetic information, genome, any genes, that's all DNA. Okay? So biological evolution occurs in a population. What's the definition of a population? A group of the same species in the same location. Okay? So like right now, you and I are a population because we're in the same location, we're of the same species. A population. Biological evolution occurs in a population when specific processes cause the genomes of organisms to differ from those of their ancestors. What specific processes? Okay, natural selection, but before natural selection, what caused there to be a difference in the genome? We just said it. A mutation. A random mutation occurred. That a mutation, if it's selected for, do you remember what that means? Like you can survive long enough to reproduce. If it's selected for, that mutation eventually becomes an adaptation, and that adaptation is spread throughout that population and slowly leads us through evolution. So it goes mutation, adaptation, evolution. But that doesn't happen overnight. This happens over generations. And it's about to bring in that time factor. So let's talk about how long a generation is. How long is a generation? Okay, from one offspring, when that offspring matures and reproduces another offspring. So quantify that for me, please, and thank you. How long can that be? Because this is biology, so we don't just study humans. We study all life. So for a bacteria, a generation may be 3 or 4 hours. For you and I, a generation is like years, 20, 30 years. For an elephant, generations are, do you see what I'm saying? So we now use like a term, when we say generations, that's a very vague term because it's very specific to what that organism is. And so these changes, these mutations have to lead to beneficial adaptation so that that organism is selected for. If they are selected for, by definition, they survive long enough to reproduce, and hopefully that mutation is passed onto their kid. So we start to see that pattern. That takes time. Evolution doesn't just happen. Okay? So that's what this is saying here. By studying these products of evolution, how things have changed, biologists have figured out what's causing these changes, because have we always understood that? The answer is no, we didn't. We just thought, well, I'm about to take you through what we just thought. Changes may occur by adaptation, variation. What type of variation? Genetic variation. Variation, so genetic variation or over reproduction. We'll get there. Having too many babies. Okay, this is an outline slide, but just a couple of things. We've kind of seen evolution, the study of evolution, evolve. It began with a Christian belief, and we're going to start with that where we used to think that everything was born to be perfect, okay? And then we slowly started realizing that even if you were born to be perfect, then why do you keep changing? Because if you were already perfect, you wouldn't need to change. You would already be perfect, okay? Then Lamarck, and all of these names, I don't speak French or German, like all the different signs, so I'm not going to use my fancy accents because I'm just going to read them the way they are. But if you're interested in how they sound, you can maybe like go to pronunciation on YouTube. Like they sound really cool. I just don't speak like that, sorry. But Lamarck, he developed he was the first to write on evolution. He was the very first to say, I can see that things are changing over time. Okay? But did he know what DNA was? Do you remember how long we've known that DNA is used as DNA? Not long. It was like the 50s, 1950s, that we became aware of this. So when we're talking about scientists in the 16, 17, 1800s, even early 1900s, we don't know what DNA is. Okay? We call these things characters, these traits. We had no idea about genetic material. Then different geologists, it's giving Charles Lyell as an example, shows that the Earth is changing over time. So the Earth is changing over time, and now we kind of see that living organisms are changing over time. So what do you think might be stimulating the living organisms to change? The environment. And we'll start to say this staple statement, that your environment will impact your gene expression. It does it now. We can prove it scientifically, that the environment changes the way that you act and the way that you grow and develop. So Charles Darwin, it mentions Alfred Wallace as well, and I appreciate that because not a lot of people know about Alfred Wallace, but Charles Darwin was a young man when he went on the HMS Beagle, and I think we go through his story here, but he was married to his cousin, and they had 10 kids, and he was very, very wealthy. He came from a very wealthy family. He himself was not naturally wealthy, like he didn't earn it. He was born into it. His dad wanted him to go to school to be a doctor. The first time he saw blood, he fainted. He said, okay. His dad said, you're such a disappointment. Because he was a doctor, and the other brother was a doctor. So he said, if you're not going to be a doctor, you'll be a priest. And sent him through seminary, and he became a priest. But he just didn't like it. And at 22, after having 2 full degrees, he was offered an opportunity to sail around the world with this map maker that the Queen had ordered to map the ocean and the different continents. And he took that opportunity to get away from his family because he had been told, this is what you have to do. And you guys kind of know, like some of your parents are like, this is what you're going to do. So this dude was like, heck yeah, let me get on this boat and be gone. The best part is that he was gone. The worst part is that he is seasick the entire time. So he was just, in every story or account of what he was doing, it's just like he's sick, he's frail. So he was really excited whenever they would dock the boat or stop for resources because he would jump off, and that's really where he started collecting things. So when he got on that ship, he didn't go in saying, I'm going to discover and study evolution. He did it because he was trying to get off the boat, and he was bored walking around, so he just started collecting things. But once he did get back, he had all these crazy, awesome thoughts in his head, and he started talking with one of his colleagues, Alfred Wallace. But here's the thing. At this point in time, he comes back, he gets married, his cousin, 10 kids, there's no TV, huge house, right? And he stays in his study, and he writes all his thoughts, but he hides them. And why does he hide them? It's against the church. Evolution is against the church because at this time the church says everything is created and perfect, like it's divine creation. So he hides it because he doesn't want his family to suffer any type of social repercussions. But Alfred Wallace starts talking about, well, I think I'm going to publish my work. In science, the only way you become famous is by doing what? Sharing. Publishing. You need to be the first, too. Because if you're second, you stole it from somebody else. So when he was realizing that there might be some type of competition, I'm going to go ahead and publish my book. And when he did, the whole town was like, of course, at that point, his wife and children were like, oh. And you either loved Darwin or you hated him, and there's tons of cartoons all after that are either saying he's horrible, 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 or he's a genius, and why haven't we thought about this before? Okay? But the fact that he goes down in history means that at some point, being famous was more important than protecting his wife and kids. I mean, what do you do? I don't know. Radical for sure. So here are those two gentlemen there. Good-looking pictures. Okay? So where we started with evolution. We started with like a nature type setting. And that came from Aristotle, who discussed, or he preached and taught, because he was like this great teacher, and many of you already know that if you've taken philosophy. And he says everything was created in divinity. Like we have this natural scale, or scala, I'm about to say it, naturae. Like it's a natural scale of perfection. And everything is born perfect and in a divine creation, and there's no need for change. Okay? And the study of natural theology is a catalog of what God had created. But what this didn't explain is how this perfect organism may have an offspring that looked slightly different, or may have had more characteristics or fewer characteristics, or different characteristics, but the same. So that didn't explain any type of change. Taxonomy is our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, which we studied in 1406. And that was Carolus Linnaeus. He's the one who came up with that. But remember, whenever we first started classifying, and maybe you don't remember, but throwback, you were either a plant or an animal, and that was it. And it wasn't until much later that we realized, once we had microscopes, that there was potential for smaller unicellular organisms. And what does unicellular mean? Single cell, just one cell. So we then have our bacteria, which are prokaryotic, but we can also see protists. We can also see fungi. So now we have 6 kingdoms. And if you recall from 1406, bacteria used to be called Monera. We had one kingdom, Monera, and then we further divided them between extremists like Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. But that's a 1406 lecture. This is also reviewed in your taxonomy assignment that you're supposed to do. So remember that. Then we have some more scientists who come along. Francis Bacon is responsible for coming up with the scientific method. And I think that's one of my favorite things to teach in 06, because really everything you do is based on the scientific method. So you truly eat because of the scientific method. You make the observation that you're hungry. Then you hypothesize, I'm probably hungry because I haven't eaten, right? And so then you eat, you carry out that experiment, and you're no longer hungry. And so your conclusion is, I was hungry because I needed to eat, and once I ate, I was no longer hungry. Okay, so Francis Bacon is in charge of, or given the credit for, our scientific method. Then we have a slew of scientists, Galileo, Copernicus, that are giving us information on the physical characteristics of the Earth. Physical. What's the difference between physical and biological? There's nothing living, so tell me what changes. This is physical. Okay, so does it mutate? No, it doesn't have the same characteristics of life. So when you study physical events, these are things that are unchanging. We can have principles. We can have laws. Because the same thing happens every time. Versus biological events, there's always room for change. So we can't just say, well, it's a law. Every cell will create a new cell, because is that true? No. So we have our theories for biology. Okay, so I do want you to make sure that you listen whenever we're talking specifically about the physical Earth versus the biological Earth. So we're talking about things that can't change and laws and so on versus things that have the ability to change. So this brings us to a point in science where we can establish biogeography. Biogeography alone, if you dissect that word, what do you believe biogeography might be? The study of life in the earth. What is geography? Geography has to do with the earth for sure, but when you study geography, what do you study? Like where things are, like specific geographic locations. So combine bio with specific geographic locations. What is biogeography? Life in specific geographic locations. Okay? So biogeography. Then we have comparative morphology. I feel like comparative is a given, but what is morphology? How many of you watched how they change where? The Power Rangers, remember? They were called the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. What did they do? When they came together, what did they do? Like whenever there was something that needed to be saved. You know, because like I was always the Pink Ranger. Who are you? The White Ranger? The Red Ranger? Yellow Ranger? You know you were a Ranger at one point for Halloween, okay? And if you weren't, you don't have to admit that. But if you were, you don't have to admit that either, okay? But what did these Power Rangers do? You know, they were normal, just teenage school kids, right? And then when this awkward robot came to attack, what did they do? They transformed their physical characteristics. Okay? So comparative morphology is comparing their physical characteristics. We compare their physical characteristics because we don't know about their genetic information yet. We can only see them on the outside, so we're like, you guys look the same, you guys look the same, you two look the same. Okay, wait, this group over here doesn't match. Is it possible that these people could be related? We know that now through genetic material, but if we looked at them and said, oh, because you're female and you're male, y'all are different morphologically, you can't be related. That's what comparative morphology does. It just studies your physical characteristics and separates you or classifies you as a result of that. So biogeography, comparative morphology, and then geology, which is the study of fossils. And fossils continue to give us more and more evidence. I mean, we're uncovering them all the time. And I feel like I don't need to tell you exactly what a fossil is, but just so we're on the same page, does it have to be a bone? No. By definition, a fossil is preserved remains. Preserved remains. Preserved remains. Okay, so biogeography is where living organisms are located. This living organism, more than likely for most of us when we study biogeography, we really focus on plants. Like, where can you guarantee, well, now they can be anywhere, because in Texas we do whatever we want. But if you wanted to see palm trees, where would you go? Like to California, to these coastal areas, okay? You went to these areas where you knew you would find them. Now, of course, they're at the gas station now. Like, we do what we want to in Texas. If we want palm trees, we'll bring palm trees here. All right? And if you wanted a kangaroo or you wanted to visit a kangaroo, where would you go? Australia. But now we smuggle them in. And there's people who have them in their backyard. Okay? So you knew where things were located and kind of the distribution of those organisms. But what we started to see was that although we had marsupials, let's say, for example, a kangaroo here in Australia, I had an organism show up, let's say, 7,000 miles in another direction that looked very similar, but was not the same. Had similar characteristics, but was not identical. So they're like, okay, so how did that work out? And I know the example your book uses is flightless birds. Right here. So we have, most people see ostriches, and I don't know how this worked out for you, but I was exposed to ostriches early on, like when you would go through those drive-through zoos. And so then whenever I'm older and I figure out what a ray and an emu are, I'm like, oh, those are just wannabe ostriches. Like, it never entered my mind until, of course, I became a huge nerd, that these potentially were artificially selected for or the result of importation, like somebody had brought them in. But the reality is there's some marked differences. Even if you look at the length of their necks, why does the length of the neck matter? It's how they access their food resources. I can tell you right here that this bird is really successful at accessing food where? Really low. Versus this one over here who can access food from higher locations. Now, if I put this organism in this habitat, tell me what would happen. Why would it die? It wouldn't have the characteristics necessary to survive in that environment. So what we have seen is the reason why these organisms, they're similar, but they're different. What have they adapted to? Their environment. And slowly they've begun to evolve into this new organism. Okay, and we can see that with Darwin and all of that. But how are they so similar? If they have specifically evolved to their environment, which they have, we already know that. Why are they so similar? Like, we have 3 flightless birds that are located in very different ecosystems, far from one another. Is that just random? What is the theory, or let's say this, the hypothesis, does anyone know, as to why these organisms that look very similar, how they got so far apart? What is that called? Is there continental drift? What did they call it when it was all together? Pangea. Yes, you were both right. 100% both right. That they were all together, and then as things started to shift, and what was it that separated them? Something living? Something physical. These volcanoes started to shift, these plate tectonics, and things were separated. And so you had families that were separated. And if you watch Littlefoot or Land Before Time, all that stuff, it shows, hurts your heart. You're like, oh, the mom and the baby are separated. But as they started to separate, you can see that these organisms were left off to different environments. And you have 2 choices. You can adapt or die. That's it. There's no plan C. All right? Can I just hang out until I can commit? No, you're gone.
I have a question.
Proceed.
So do you view Europe and Asia as different continents, or do you just view it as very
Me personally, I think that it's all together. I mean, I study biology, Dorian, so why are you going to put me on the spot, right?
I was just wondering, because I always look at it as Eurasia. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're the same. I say that they're the same, but I'm going to say that, and you're going to be like, well, you're wrong. I'm like, oh, I don't. I say that they're, because it's within, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was just wondering.
Yeah. That's just me, though. If you don't agree, that's okay. We don't have to agree. Okay? Next study is comparative morphology. So we're comparing physical characteristics. We're saying because they have these characteristics that are similar to one another, they have to be related. And because they don't have similar characteristics, guess what? No way. The fact that you and your sister, I have a sister who has blonde hair and green eyes, and she's 2 inches taller than I am, and she's my little sister. I told her the entire time we were growing up that she was adopted. Okay? Because I was like, I just don't get it. We don't even look the same. How did we come from the same parents? Okay, so, I was the mean older sister. I 100% admit it, and I've probably sent her into some emotional issues. But I just didn't get it. We didn't look the same, so I don't see how we could be related. That's truly how things were classified early on. Okay? So they're just using their anatomical structure, so that's the definition or the explanation for morphology, to decide whether or not they're related. Okay? Now, let's talk about vestigial structures. This gentleman right here, Leclerc, also called Count Buffon, he came up with, or he discovered vestigial structures. Has anyone ever heard of a vestigial structure? A vestigial structure is a structure that's been left behind because it's no longer in use. It's been left behind because it's no longer in use. Let me give you an example. If you find the carcass of a whale, they have a hip bone. Do you know what hip bones are used for? Walking. I just said you found them in a whale. What's the problem here? They don't even have back legs, no hind limbs, nothing. What does that give us evidence of? They used to walk. They used to walk. You can find countless amounts of evidence that show, and if you don't like dinosaurs, I'm not asking you to believe it, okay, so please don't be like, okay, but that show that what caused these large land walking terrestrial vertebrates to be forced underwater? As the sea level rose, as the ice melted, as the sea level rose, did it rise like overnight and you either had to sink or swim? No, it was slow. It was slow and progressive, and these large organisms were forced to learn to live in or die. That pelvic bone is evidence that there used to be hind limbs. And each generation, that pelvic bone gets smaller and smaller because of what we call atrophy. Does anyone know what atrophy means? If you don't use it, you lose it. So it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But the fact that we can still look at a whale carcass and see a hip bone tells us at one point that organism walked. It supported its own weight. Yes, ma'am.
Could this be why when we're in water for a long period of time, our fingers
That's actually because of keratin. That's an anatomy lecture. And osmosis. But not necessarily because we used to live in water. Does that make sense? It's the thought process, I get it. I get what you're thinking. There is an organ that you and I have that's vestigial. The appendix. We don't use our appendix, and we don't even need our appendix. Well, now science says that we do. That people without an appendix now get cancer. But right now, everybody gets cancer, so I didn't mean to spoil that for you. Too soon. We just met today, and I told you one of us is going to get cancer. It's either going to be me or you. Statistics show 50%. But the appendix was used, it's filled with this bacteria, and it was used in larger in our primitive ancestors because they didn't cook their meat. So it helped to kind of keep their gut clean when they ate this raw meat. If you and I were to eat that raw meat now, and we hadn't before, can you tell me what it would do to our digestive tract? Yeah, we would get really sick. Like you would have some diarrhea for a while, And if you kept doing it, eventually your body would get used to it, but it would be a long process and probably not very comfortable. But we have an appendix, and what's happened over the years because we haven't used it? It gets smaller and smaller. So vestigial structures are leftover structures that were used in our ancestors, and they're evidence that organisms have evolved. There's quite a few other vestigial structures, but those are just a couple that I wanted to bring up. Homologous. You and I learned the root homo last semester. What does homo mean? Same. Homologies are one of my favorite way of showing that we all come, and here, let me just tell you the answer to almost every test question that asks this. We all come from a common ancestor. Can you tell me who our ancestor is? All life. Bacteria. Your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa was a bacteria. Okay? That's a thing. And now you kill bacteria like that with your hand sanitizers and stuff. But long, long ago, we had a common ancestor. We all share a common ancestor. Now, more recent organisms that share common ancestors have what we call homologous structures. And this is just a truncated version. There's quite a few that are really extensive. You could put a human arm up here, and it would still work. You could put the front limb of a horse up here, and it still matches. So what we have here, homologous structures, are structures that are built the same, but function different. So they have the same structure but different function. Homologous is same structure but different function. Same structure but different function. So here I have the forelimb or foreleg of a pig. Humerus, we have a humerus. We have the ulna and the radius. You and I have an ulna and radius. We have the carpals. Like, we all have similar structures. Can you tell me why I use my humerus, ulna, radius, carpal, metacarpals, and phalanges this way and they use it that way? Okay, true. But we inhabit different environments. Yes. Yes. We inhabit different environments. Flippers of a dolphin. Same thing with whale fins. Humerus, ulna, radius, carpals, metacarpals, phalanges. Why does it look like that and not like this? They use it to swim. We can use ours to swim, but are we that efficient? No. We're like, but still, the wing of a bat. Humerus, ulna, radius. I think this is creepy, kind of like, you're like, oh, because these are the fingers. Like, that's some really long fingers. But still, homologous structure, same structure, different function. Okay? Evidence of evolution. Fossils. Let me real quick, while we're on homologous, I'm going to throw in analogous structures. Analogous is the opposite. Homologous says same structure, different function. Analogous structures are same function, different structure. You need to know the difference. Analogous are same function, but different structure. Analogous are same function, but different structure. And real quick, let me give you an example. Like bird wings and bat wings. What are they both used for? Flying, but do they have the exact same bones? What about insect wings? Used for flight, but built differently. So analogous structures have the same function, but a different structure. Okay? So then we talk about fossils, and I want to just reiterate the fact that fossils are any type of preserved remains. Preserved remains can be in any form. Bones, of course, everybody sees that, or petrified rocks, petrified logs. I don't know how many of you are aware, but a few years ago they found a whole woolly mammoth baby frozen in ice, completely intact, dead, but had been stuck in this glacier. It was a preserved remains. So people were like, was that a fossil? Yeah, it was preserved. It was the remains of once living organism. And it was just frozen in time. So fossils, any type of preserved remain. When we talk about stratification, we talk about the layering of sedimentary rocks. Sedimentary rocks grow in layers. And what we can see when we start to chip away at these layers are different versions of fossils. There's a lot of different fossil activities that we can do with this, but ultimately what it's showing is that the lowest are the oldest, right? And that as we come up each layer, the fossils kind of change slightly. What causes these slight changes in the fossils? Okay, erosion could actually to hurt the fossil itself, but why did that organism change slightly by the next time that sediment had formed? The environment changed. So we start to see evolution occurring, and we can see evidence of it if we look at fossils. So we can find fossils down here that maybe match or look similar to fossils 5 or 6 layers up. And I say match or look similar because they may have some similar characteristics, but a lot has changed during that time in the environment. Okay? And when we find a whole lot of the same fossil in one layer, what does that give us evidence of? Extinction. Something catastrophic happened that perhaps wiped out that entire population. Okay? Paleobiology or paleontology, so we're studying these fossils, but paleobiology is adding the life aspect to it. So we're studying the fossils of living organisms. in catastrophism is what I had just mentioned. Like if we find a whole bunch of fossils in the same layer, it may be the result of some catastrophic event, like a volcano or an earthquake or a flood or something, a huge fire that wiped out an asteroid that wiped out this population and sent it into extinction. And George Cuvier is responsible for the coining of the term catastrophism. All right, this is where I am going to stop our lecture for today. So